So Mendel, Gregor Mendel, was a monk. He lived in Brno, what is now Brno, Czechia, which is the new name for the Czech Republic. You can still go to the monastery there. He was a Moravian monk, and he wanted to be a physics teacher, like a high school teacher, and he was deemed unsuitable for that career. He had one interview. I think he went back for a second interview, but he left before he even interviewed, and he did not become a physics professor, but he was interested in inheritance. There were some other individuals doing work in peas at the time. The scientific name of peas is Pisum sativum, and there were some publications on some crosses that had been done, what they call hybridizations of peas. And he became interested in this. And at the time, there were several concepts of inheritance that were floating around. You'll recognize some of these from the lecture. Chapter 1, pangenesis, blending, inheritance, the idea of preformationism, which involves the homunculus. Preformationism. So there were all these ideas about inheritance, but nobody had used data to demonstrate that any one of them, that any were correct. And so he used the peas and math to show, or to ultimately show that pangenesis was wrong, blending was wrong, preformationism was wrong. And so then he had to come up with a new idea, which we now call germplasm theory, or the particulate germplasm theory, yeah. It's part of that, or the particulate method of inheritance. These are all kind of old-fashioned terms. Particulate inheritance is an old-fashioned term, but he didn't use the language that we use now, but when you substitute modern language in, what he figured out was that genes are on chromosomes. Chromosomes are passed to daughter cells during cell division, and that meiosis makes gametes, and when gametes fuse together, that creates the new individual, and those chromosomes carry those copies of genes into the new individual. So he was working at a time when they didn't have the knowledge of meiosis that they have now, that we have now. They didn't understand, they didn't know about chromosomes, they didn't know about genes per se. He used language like factors and particles, but we're going to use the modern language when we talk about what Mendel did. Mendel always did his crosses in the same way. He would take a pea plant that had a certain trait, let's say a pea plant that had purple flowers, and on pea plants, if one flower on the plant is purple, they're all purple. So it's not like some are purple and some are different color. They're all purple on that plant. Then he would self-fertilize, because on plants you have pollen and you have eggs on the same flower. Self-fertilize those plants, get the seeds from that, plant the seeds in the ground, grow up the offspring of that self-fertilization. And what he did is he was basically double-checking the plants. And so when he took a purple flower plant and self-fertilized it, and he grew up all the offspring. If he got all the different seeds grew into plants that only had purple flowers, he would call that one a true breeding plant. And so he would save that plant. If he self-fertilized a purple flower plant and some of the offspring plants had purple flowers but some had white flowers, he would throw that plant away. So he would do this kind of pre-check on the plants to make sure that they were true breeding. Why he thought to do that, I can't really say, but it was important for his interpretation of his final results. And then the same for like a plant with white flowers. He would self-fertilize it, and if it only had the seeds that came from that self-fertilization, he planted those, and if they only gave white flower plants, he would call that true breeding. So now Mendel worked for years and years, I'm going to say like 13 years on these projects. It wasn't just like a weekend project. So this was a long-term project for him. And finally, when he checked all the plants to save the ones that were true breeding for these different traits. I gave you the example of flowers. Then the next step would be to cross the two different plants. So cross a purple flower plant that was true breeding, and I'm going to use a little X, that means a cross, and cross it to a white flower plant. Now, you guys probably know on a plant, you have the pollen contains the sperm, and then another part of the flower contains the eggs, called the ovary. So you can put the pollen onto the ovary. So the pollen from the purple flower plant maybe was put onto the ovary of the white flower plant, and vice versa. Vice versa would be the white flower plant pollen put onto the ovary of the purple flower plant. So those would be called reciprocal crosses. But no matter how the cross was done, in this case, he got the offspring of this cross would be, in this case, you don't know ahead of time what it's going to be, but he got all the offspring of this when he planted the seeds had purple flowers. Now, they weren't light purple. It wasn't like a blending. It wasn't like purple and white blend to make lavender. It was the same dark purple color as the one parent had. And so at that point, he knew that blending couldn't be correct. And when he repeated this kind of method with other traits, like plants that only put out green seeds and plants that put out yellow seeds, or plants that put out plants that were tall and crossed to plants that were short, he never got an offspring that was intermediate between those two true breeding parents. So by that kind of confirmation, he felt like blending was not what was happening, at least in pea plants. Then he had to ask the question, is it preformationism? Did all the traits come from one parent and nothing from the other? Because the homunculus is the idea that the entire individual is completely contained in the sperm. All the traits would come from that parent and nothing really from the other parent, which, again, is kind of hard to understand why they thought that would be true. But in any case, so that maybe he thought that it was the homunculus concept, that all the traits from these offspring purple flower plants were exactly the same as these purple flower parent plants. So what he would do then is that he would take those and self-fertilize. And when he self-fertilized those offspring plants, they would not give all purple. Those plants gave some purple offspring, some purple flowered offspring, and some white flowered offspring. So then he was really confused because there was really no existing concept that would predict this kind of outcome. But the important thing about Mendel is he always checked the plants ahead of time to make sure they were true breeding, and then he would cross them. All right. The first cross, like for example, when you cross a purple flower plant that's true breeding to a white flower plant that's true breeding, that cross doesn't really have a name. Purple to white. All right, but the offspring of that cross do have a name. They're called the hybrids. I guess you could call the parents are true breeding, and then you would have the hybrid. The hybrid is a cross of two parents that are different. In modern language, we would say heterozygous, but he called it the hybrid. In the case of the flowers, purple flower was the hybrid color. So the hybrid was purple. Now, when he self-fertilized the hybrid purples, for example, when he self-fertilized those, the offspring of the hybrid purple crossed to hybrid purple, which is one way that you can think about it, it's self-fertilized. That cross right there is, this cross here is called the monohybrid cross, or the hybrid cross, because you're mating, there's a mating between two hybrid parents. So that's the monohybrid cross, and the offspring of the monohybrid cross gave both purple flower and offspring and white flowered offspring. All right, but these were the crosses he always did. He always self-fertilized what we call the parental plants ahead of time. Then he crossed them to get the hybrid plants, and then he self-fertilized the hybrid plants, and that's the hybrid cross. So this part here is the hybrid cross. It's kind of important in the way the language is used. So the offspring of the hybrid cross has, in Mendel's setup, has certain ratios, which we will talk about. All right. So that gives you a little bit of background about what Mendel did. Now, when he finally published his paper and presented it to a group, they did not seem to get it. And so it really just went on the shelf. His publication went on the shelf. He died in 1884, and it wouldn't be until 1900 that 3 or 4 groups would rediscover Mendel's work and finally recognize what it was that he had done. All right, so that's the end of Mendel's methods.